best only rank 6th with respect to their occurrence in the projects, also according to the project leaders. So on the one hand, in the perception of the young people themselves, and also corroborated by the same result for the project leaders. And then, second example, use of traditional methods, such as listening to inputs, and that's a quote now, listening to inputs, ranks 2nd as occurring in the projects, but only 7th in relation to how participants learn best. Okay? So for project leaders, Ray reports that they learn best from designing the project, cooperating with colleagues from abroad, and implementing activities for or with participants. These 3 learning situations did not occur as frequently. Now, the activities that happen the most often seem to be reflecting and talking about the project experience, informal time or experiences in the project, and cooperating with colleagues from one's own country, or one's own organization, from one's own organization. Yeah? And these 3 things, they rank low in terms of how project leaders learn best. So these things make me think about some key debates in the non-formal education community of practice, of which Youth in Action, I think, is part. Now, the learner-centered approach and its real place, its actual place in the practice. Now, practitioners and how they reflect, critically or not, but generally how they reflect on the relevance, adaptation, suitability of their approach and the methods they choose for the specific groups of young people they are working with. Educational innovation and the risk it may involve for practitioners, who continue to do things quite often because they have always done it that way and because it works, and because they've been taught that it should be done that way. So I'm wondering around this whether there's sometimes a little more ideology in non-formal education and with regard to non-formal education than we sometimes want to admit. And by extrapolation, the question would be, how does the training that people get in non-formal education contribute to that and to the development of that? Yeah, I think it remains, also another debate, but I think there's, to a certain extent, it remains difficult for practitioners, maybe not only in Youth in Action, but in general in non-formal education, to let go of control, right? Because they've learned that non-formal education has to be planned and have clear learning objectives and a curriculum. And the question for me is whether or not that's the reflection should rather be whether or not, the question should rather be whether or not we have any control at all, or whether we should have. So on this one, I think it's really interesting to see how counterintuitive and sometimes contradictory the results can be with regard to learning and with regard to the quality of the educational offer. I'm going to skip this one because it's not so important. So, learning outcomes and other effects of Youth in Action can be counterintuitive. So, again, this is not to say that they're bad. They're just counterintuitive. They don't necessarily speak to what might be considered to be the usual wisdom. So, examples. The 2011 transnational analysis shows that learning to learn, which is not a Youth in Action objective, ranks higher in terms of perceived achievement than civic competence, which is a Youth in Action objective. Mathematical skills or communication, these are all lifelong learning competencies. So mathematical skills or communication in the first language are developed at an equal level as digital and media skills, which one might expect to be fostered much more through Youth in Action projects. Youth democracy projects and EVS show the lowest percentage for effects on project management competence, which is surprising since youth democracy projects should especially take a participatory approach, and participation in EVS normally involves working in a project. Another example, results for the contribution of EVS to skills development are weakest for civic competence, which is counterintuitive considering its volunteering focus and the standard wisdom on the role of volunteering for the development of civic competence. And it seems also from the transnational studies that EVS hosting experience is more significant for skills development than sending experience. The assumption is usually that going to another country provides for a more intensive learning experience. Youth democracy projects show relatively low increase for commitment against discrimination, intolerance, xenophobia and racism, and for support for people with fewer opportunities. This is counterintuitive because these issues are strongly related to democracy. And youth initiatives show relatively low increases for interest in European issues. Yeah, I think that's, it's probably not so surprising because it does reflect the challenge of these projects, which are so locally embedded, to include a European dimension. But what all of this together does is raise questions about how to ensure that the learning objectives set are actually met, at the same time as leaving room for experimentation and innovation that leads to unexpected outcomes. Many of these are not bad outcomes, they're just unexpected outcomes. So this also raises questions about things like, what does learning signify for those designing and implementing projects? It may not quite match with the way the program sees it. Methodological practices of developing, implementing, and evaluating, and their relationship to acquiring key competences is another area of question marks, I think. It seems a truly participatory approach is one of the most important factors influencing learning and competence development positively, far more important than consuming the project, in which case, how do we get to that point? How do we get to the point where the practice is truly participatory? Contents, themes, and foci of projects and their relationship to learning, are the contents more or less as important than the process? And what does that mean for the way that projects are done? How do we see the relationship between objectives and result? The reality of how non-formal education is delivered sometimes clashes with the reality of how young people learn in the projects and the ideological positions of those delivering non-formal education in the projects, possibly. What about training for those running the activities, right? What does this all tell us for that? And what about the whole idea of developing minimum standards? Yeah, that I think is an important dimension. So I think the results on what specific project types achieve best in youth in action, because that was an interesting dimension of the transnational study. It looked at which project types did what best, yeah? Can be useful for reflecting on how the program evolves and its conceptualization in the future. Some project types seem to be all-rounders, and others seem to be more effective for delivering specific learning outcomes. This picks up on what our colleague said earlier about civic competence. Ray tells us some interesting things about which formats deliver best, for which kinds of objectives. How can we learn from that? It also tells us something about the kinds of mix of project types that deliver for particular objectives. So do we have the right mix of project types right now in order to deliver the objectives of the program? And depending on what the program is supposed to achieve, could the mix be different? Yeah? Or one might simply reconsider some of the objectives of the program as a whole and check the extent to which the ones that there are realistic. Again, I think one of the colleagues raised the question of the realism of the program as well. So that brings us to the end of the section on quality and the last set of slides. But I still have one more question for you to consider in your groups, and that is, have you experienced any of these situations? 10 minutes? Okay, we make it slower. I mean, make it faster. It's fine. Okay, energy is starting to wane, so we'll speed this one up a little bit. Yeah, 2 more minutes on this one. Okay, let's wind it up on that last question. Does anybody have something that they'd like to raise with regard to that last set of statements, slides? Have you experienced any of those situations? Okay, so maybe the energy isn't as low as I thought. People are still talking.
But still we have to round up because we're running out of time. So if you stop your bus groups, and first thing that we would like to know is if there is reactions or comments from this last round of discussions that you had.
Yeah.
Hello again. I have just 2 points. The first one is about the participation and the participative approach in the projects. And there was mentioned that there is the low level of the participation level participation approach in the projects. And I would like to stress just one thing, and that's there is as well the different perspective of concrete person, what is actually already participation and what is not. Just example from formal education again. One class is totally open to do whatever. I mean, they are developing a lot of ideas and I am giving just the space and just facilitating the space. But the other class, it's totally closed. I mean, if I will make the same just to give the space and facilitate the space, they will sit and stay like, oh, and nothing. I mean, for them, of course, everything will be participative. But for the others, if they are used to be participative, it's not participative. So how to actually make a research on this? It's impossible. Just qualitative, maybe, not quantitative. And second was that there was not so developed the project management skills in the youth democracy projects. I think that it can have as well. It can have some explanation when you are looking at the target groups of the youth democracy projects. Because on one hand, there is a group of people which are doing the project. It's a group of young people. It can be like 30 people, for example. But there is a secondary target group which is like, for example, 400 people which are not directly involved into the project management of the overall project. That means in the evaluation or in research, you are getting 430 people, and you are getting data out of this target group. You are not having them divided into okay, he took part in the project management, he didn't. So it's as well again impossible to get it by quantitative research.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I think with the respect of the compatibility of what was learned within which action project type, there's a little bit of a myth about these objectives, the specific objectives of the program, because as they were meant, objective number 1 was for action 1, objective number 2 for action 2, and so on. Objective number 5 for action 5. But if you look at the objectives, they overlap, and so they don't work like that. And the actions don't work like that already, how they are conceptualized. So let's forget for the time being that you have 5 actions with 5 specific objectives and measure it against it. I think that would be simplifying something that is much more complex.
Still thinking about that, about the quality in the Youth in Action and Erasmus Plus and quality of youth work and all this which has no common ground yet, so that we can actually say sometimes quality of youth work, youth projects in one country is very different than in the other, and at the same time we have from the program come along quality criteria for each of these action types that we grant projects in and where these projects take place. And I was actually thinking it would be very interesting exercise to take these quality criteria that we use, that are developed by the European Commission, mostly in some consultation with the national agencies, but not so inclusively, and try to measure or try to compare them or link them with some sort of common ground of youth work quality and the ideal, if there exists any. That would be interesting.
An exciting project.
In fact, I think when we look at quality, I mean, you use the term quality because of describing what you think is quality, but I think, if I understand right, when Youth in Action started, there were not clear quality criteria, they evolved,
Yeah.
but it would make sense for the new program to have an agreed framework of quality against which we can measure then quality of the projects, or quality of the program.
Well, this particular point is taking us very nicely into the very last part of the reflection. I mean, we wanted to have a more open discussion. I have one question to throw out into the floor, and I know that we don't have an awful lot of time, so I apologize for that. But, what dilemmas do these ideas raise for you, if any? And maybe we can take one or two rounds on that, and then we close it up.
One area that I've been thinking about a little bit is the idea of objectives and aims as tactics in order to negotiate the space for the programme. So I wonder whether how much does it actually matter if there isn't a kind of direct line right the way through? Because a group of politicians, they might need to hear certain things in order to give the space to the programme. And if those are heard, do we want that all to trickle down all the way through to the delivery level? And I think one of the things that's a real success of the programme is that this space has been created and there's some really great, exciting projects, and some of them could be improved and whatever, but that flexibility is quite nice.
Well, to me, it also comes back to some of the topics we've already mentioned yesterday, and that's communication between the research and practice in this case. For instance, when we're speaking about this learning in the non-formal learning projects, there's lots of things which I believe would be very useful to the project leaders and to the people who actually take care of the youth. But do they really have the data? Do they really read something like this? Do they go to the web page which says research on blah blah blah? So it's again just I think for me it brings lots of questions as to how to communicate these ideas and these research findings, which I believe could be potentially valuable to some. How to communicate them to the right groups.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Yael. I've greatly enjoyed those provocations and the discussions that followed from them. And yes, and if I'm not sure if this is a dilemma or just a bit of a tension that I'm experiencing, but which I'd probably experience anyway, given that I'm a researcher and someone involved in youth work. And the tension is, or the dilemma is, has to do with knowing whether to respond to your questions and your challenges in relation to what could work better in the program, or in terms of how could we better know what could work better in the program. And some of the points that have come up, including your last one, for example, has to do with really research methodology and research design, and how best to approach research questions and selecting the best ways of answering different types of research question. whereas some of the other comments and suggestions that have been made have to do more with how you run programs properly. And so I think while the two should work together, we need to be absolutely clear at any one time which one we're primarily addressing.
If you say dilemmas, I think one of the dilemmas for me is that a lot of the issues you raised, and I thank you, by the way, for doing this with an outside view and discovering things that we have not found ourselves, but that some of the issues you addressed should also be or need to be addressed towards policy development. Because some of the problems or potential room for improvement is not only because we could improve practice, but there needs also some other intervention that enables to develop practice. That's one thing. And the second thing which I see as a dilemma, that when I thought about quality, that we have to be cautious how to define for ourselves quality, also in view of what is quality definition in formal education. Because and not getting trapped in this, because formal education looks at quality of outcomes now. That's what PISA TIMSS is all about. What comes out of the educational system? And I would see it as a trap to go into that. And we do exactly that by saying what ranks best as an outcome, as an effect. And I think the quality discussion for the non-formal field is very much a process quality. It's also structural quality of how do we set up the system of implementing the program. That's also quality. But the process quality is where we trust if the process is good, then the output will be good too. That's what I mean. You know, the process and output are directly interlinked, but we don't measure the output. We actually see how can we improve the quality in the processes. I think that's my assumption. And we have to be clear about where we're going with this quality discussion.
I feel like a baby in this at this table, but nonetheless, it has come to my curiosity. This data set we're perhaps missing, and that's the let me frame it this way. I am a coach. I coach high school students and in debating, and we have this saying. The way we judge today is the way the students are going to debate tomorrow. And the data set, perhaps, that we are not looking at is the actual selection of the projects, the quality and the assessment of evaluators. Because what we are looking at is the quality of the output precisely, but not at what has actually been written into the project in the beginning. So maybe a comparison or a quick correlation with that data set would give us a few interesting insights into what has been the actual intent for the projects in the beginning.
I have a psychological dilemma. Because, I mean, you said it, and the completed Ray research is about Youth in Action, the last program. And I sit here and I think of the program now, and I see what you point out as problems, and then I think, yeah, it goes a bit in this direction. And I had the feeling of like self-fulfilling prophecies. So point things out so as a defender of Youth in Action, when I look at this, I would look at, in Youth in Action, this, that's right, but it was there, you said it on a high level, but it was not such a thing and such a big problem in a way. It was there, it's good that you pointed out, and then I think, but it might go in this direction a bit more in the new program. So this is like pointing this out. It could be self-fulfilling prophecies for the new program period in a way, or work against them. That's the other point.
Sorry, so one more to add was for me there's a dilemma as to where you draw the boundaries around the system. So I think that a lot of the issues that have been identified this afternoon that are visible through the lens of the Youth in Action programme aren't actually the responsibility of the Youth in Action programme. So they're based on, so it's the issues of the way that the NGOs are working, the way that municipalities are working, and the programme has limited control over the recruitment, selection, the training and the skills there. So I think it's a question of which things are within the control of the programme.
Okay, maybe it's a time problem. We have to round up. Maybe you want to react or have the last word, actually?
Thanks. There have been a lot of words today. I mean, everything you say is relevant, and I'm supposed to write a paper now based on some of the discussions and some of the feedback, and take the thing a little bit further. Yeah. So I think it'll be interesting to see what comes from the paper and what can be done with it. Yeah. My original brief was to prepare a practice brief, something that would inform practice. I'm not quite sure where that brief is going to go, and what the thing will look like. I know that you guys are going to talk quite a lot about it tomorrow. Unfortunately, I can't be there at that discussion. It would be much better if I was, but I will pick up from the report and pick up from your further discussions what I can take from there. And I think it's a process in evolution. I mean, the new studies have to be developed, and you have a lot more work to do still on how Ray is going to influence the program in some way or another. So I think we can work with the results. I think what my experience of doing this has shown me is that there's much more there than one might imagine, and a lot of it is counterintuitive, and a lot of it has to be taken with caution, but it really does bring very, very interesting questions to the fore. And just because we talk about practice and because we're looking at practice doesn't mean that it's only practice relevant. Yeah, I think there's an awful lot which came out of my reading. For me, there was an awful lot of the reading of those studies, which has enormous implications for policy, enormous implications for how the program is going to develop in the future and how it might eventually also change. Yeah, knowing that we will be almost halfway through the program very soon. So yeah, so I thank you for your patience, and your how would I say? Your ability to withstand mega presentations in the afternoon after lunch. And sorry for not being here tomorrow, but thank you for the input. And good luck with what you still have to do.
Well, also from our side, a big thank you to you for doing all this reading and this work and flying in just for an afternoon of presentation. We have time to discuss more tomorrow morning, where we start at 9 o'clock already. So be prepared. And thanks again, Yael. And for me, some practical information before we go into the city. It's now 20 minutes to 5, more or less. 10 minutes to 5, the buses leave in front of the hotel. So you have 10 minutes to prepare. And prepare for a prepare, because otherwise you're missing some important bits. You have to prepare for a 2 hours walking tour. You might consider your shoes. Walking tour means also it's not looking like rain, but you never know. The bus will leave us at Schwedenplatz, which is just in the city center, and which is actually where the restaurant also is. The restaurant is called Motto, and it's where the boats to Bratislava leave. So in case during the walking tour you get lost voluntarily or involuntarily, dinner starts at 7:30 in that restaurant. So then be back there. There's a transfer back to the hotel, 10:30 and 11:30. So if you wish to take a nice ride back to the hotel, take the bus, otherwise you're on your own. Okay? And do not miss the bus now, because believe me, it's hell to get from here to the city center on your own. So enjoy.